The Mafia loved calling itself a world of honor, loyalty, and respect. Very impressive on paper. In reality, a lot of their so-called sacred rules sound like they were invented by paranoid uncles, failed actors, and men who took table manners more seriously than murder. Today, we're going through 10 of the dumbest mafia rules in history, and some of these are so absurd they make the gangsters look less terrifying and way more embarrassing. Number 1. The maternal leash, the Sunday dinner law. In the hyper-masculine world of the Italian-American Mafia and the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the tough guy persona was the primary currency. These were men who made their livings through taxing businesses, high-stakes hijacking, and resolving disputes with heavy-caliber firearms. However, there was one entity more powerful than any commission or any boss of bosses: the Italian mother. In old-school mob culture, the maternal bond wasn't just a private sentiment, it was a mandatory public performance. A guy who had spent his Friday afternoon overseeing a brutal debt collection was still expected to sit meekly at his mother's Sunday lunch table. This wasn't just about family warmth, it was a strategic form of community camouflage. If the neighbors saw Tony helping his mother with the groceries or showing up every Sunday without fail, it became much harder for the public to reconcile that image with the monster the police described in the newspapers. It created a strange emotional leash. A feared captain could be in the middle of a high-level sit-down, but if his mother called to complain about a leaky faucet or to ask why he hadn't eaten his greens, he was culturally obligated to prioritize her. The comedy here is the jarring transition. You are allegedly a man of honor, a person whose word is law on the streets, yet one raised eyebrow from a 70-year-old woman in an apron can turn you back into a 12-year-old who forgot to clean his room. This rule exposed the mob's greatest irony. They sold themselves as brutal, independent outlaws, but their internal social structure was entirely dependent on maternal approval. If the mama of the neighborhood didn't like you, your reputation was effectively toast. It is hard to project the image of an underworld king when you are being publicly scolded for not having a second helping of lasagna. Number 2. The trouser leg ritual. Underworld fashion fails. Organized crime often relies on secret signals to distinguish us from them, but some groups took this into the realm of the truly bizarre. Certain Chinese triad and secret societies required candidates to roll up one trouser leg during initiation or specific ritual meetings. This originated from a time when these groups were revolutionary societies fighting the Qing dynasty, needing a quick way to identify fellow rebels in the chaos of a crowded marketplace or a nighttime raid. However, as these groups transitioned from political revolutionaries to street-level criminal syndicates, the rolled-up leg look became a permanent and highly visible recognition custom. In the dark chaos of a street fight or a back-alley deal, the logic was functional. If you see a guy with one leg hiked up, don't hit him, he's on your team. But while the practical logic of avoiding friendly fire is sound, the visual result was nothing short of ridiculous. Imagine trying to look like a high-level enforcer or a terrifying 49er, a triad rank, while one leg of your pants is hiked up to the mid-calf like you're about to wade into a muddy river to catch frogs. It is the perfect example of organized crime's obsession with secret theater. They want to look like a shadow empire that controls the fate of nations, but half the time they end up inventing rules that feel like rejected choreography from a confused high school stage play. It was efficient for identification, sure, but dignified? Absolutely not. It turned a life-or-death confrontation into a moment that looked like a poorly coordinated dance troupe. Number 3. The Halloween PR stunt, the spooky uncles. The Yamaguchi-gumi, Japan's largest and most powerful Yakuza syndicate, is an organization built on rigid hierarchy, elaborate tattoos, and billions of dollars in revenue from everything from real estate to white-collar fraud. Yet for decades, they maintained a tradition that feels like it was written by a satirist: the annual Halloween candy distribution.
Every October 31st, high-ranking members of the group would set up tables outside their headquarters in Kobe and hand out bags of sweets to local children. This was image management taken to a surreal extreme. The Yakuza have long operated as quasi-legal entities in Japan, maintaining public offices and even having their own fan magazines. By acting as the neighborhood uncles with the best snacks, they were trying to build neighborhood points. The goal was to make it socially impossible for the local community to support police crackdowns against them. How can they be bad, the logic went. They gave my kid a Kit Kat. The dumb part wasn't that the plan existed. The dumb part was the sheer theatricality of it. You had men with missing pinky fingers, a sign of Yakuza penance, and full-body Itazumi tattoos, carefully placing stickers on pumpkins. It was organized crime discovering that even gangsters need good Yelp reviews. Eventually, the Japanese police had to pass specific ordinances to ban the Yakuza from giving candy to children, essentially making gangster trick-or-treating a crime. It remains one of history's weirdest intersections of The Godfather and Willy Wonka.
Number 5. Swallow your homework, the edible accounting system. Before the era of encrypted apps and burner phones, the illegal gambling world ran on slips. In the mid-20th century, if you were a mob-affiliated bookie, you carried the evidence of your crimes in your pocket at all times. Tiny scraps of paper contained names, betting amounts, odds, and debts. If a police raid happened, those scraps of paper were the difference between a steak dinner in a social club and 5 years in a federal penitentiary. This led to the most basic and most embarrassing emergency protocol in criminal history, the edible evidence rule. Mob lore is packed with stories of bookies who, upon seeing a detective walk through the door, would immediately shove a handful of betting slips into their mouths and start chewing frantically. This was swallow your homework elevated to a professional standard. Think about the image this projects. These guys were portrayed in movies as suave, calculating masters of the underworld. In reality, a significant portion of their workday was spent practicing how to hydrate their mouths so they could digest notebook paper faster. It wasn't a cool cinematic outlaw moment. It was just a panicked man in a back room trying to eat a receipt. For all the talk of sophisticated racketeering, the mafia's ultimate backup plan for their accounting department was literally a human stomach. It was a system designed by lunatics and executed by men who had to learn the hard way that ink doesn't taste like gravy. Number 6. The Underworld Final Exam, Back to School. In recent years, the Yakuza in Japan took the concept of avoiding legal trouble to a corporate extreme. Faced with the Boteho, Anti-Boryokudan Act, which held bosses personally liable of the crimes of their subordinates, the Yakuza began requiring their members to take written exams. These weren't tests on how to pick a lock or hide a body. They were exams on the Japanese legal code. Imagine being a street-tough enforcer who joined the mob because you hated school and wanted to be a rebel. You get your tattoos, you cut off a finger to prove your loyalty, and then your boss hands you a number 2 pencil and a 12-page multiple-choice exam. The test covered topics like civil liability, new police surveillance powers, and the specific legal definitions of extortion. This is the funniest example of criminals accidentally reinventing the one thing they tried to escape, the education system. Somewhere, every disappointed teacher on earth felt a tiny burst of vindication. It turns out that even the most feared criminal syndicates hate incompetence and uneducated employees. The mob likes to sell the idea of total freedom, but eventually you discover the ancient truth. There is always a test, and if you fail it, you don't just get a bad grade, you get a very expensive legal bill for the boss.
Number 7. The Mustache Ban. Upper lip policing. The mustache ban in the American Mafia is one of the most petty examples of branding in history. In the early 20th century, the old guard of Sicilian mobsters were known as Mustache Petes. They were traditionalists who wore long facial hair, spoke only in dialect, and lived by the codes of the old country. When the younger generation, led by figures like Lucky Luciano, decided to modernize the mob into a corporate national crime syndicate, the mustache became a symbol of failure. The new rule was simple: shave it off. To the Young Turks, a mustache was a sign that you were a greenhorn who didn't understand how America worked. They wanted to look like Wall Street executives, not village goat herds. So the mustache became a banned item. If you wanted to rise through the ranks, your upper lip had to be as smooth as a polished marble floor. It is hilarious because these men claimed to be outlaws who answered to no one, yet they were policing each other's facial hair with the intensity of an insecure fashion magazine editor. You could run a multi-state narcotics ring, you could corrupt the highest levels of the judiciary, and you could eliminate your rivals without a second thought. But heaven forbid you grow a bit of hair under your nose, or the commission would think you looked uncool or outdated. Nothing says ruthless secret brotherhood quite like a group of men having a quiet panic attack because their mustache might make them look like a relic from the 1890s. Number 8. Unemployment as doctrine. The thief-in-law ego. The Russian vori i zakone, thieves in law, took the concept of being an outlaw and turned it into a bizarre form of religious extremism. Their code was built on a total rejection of the Soviet state. This meant they were forbidden from having a legitimate job, ever. Even working as a janitor in a prison was seen as contamination. To hold a paycheck from the government was to surrender your soul to the system. While this sounds like deep-seated rebellion, in practice it was just deeply stupid. It turned survival into a constant, unnecessary struggle. Imagine being a brilliant criminal strategist who is currently starving because your purity code says you can't even pick up a shovel to make a few bucks for bread. It was unemployment as sacred doctrine. This rule essentially turned the criminal life into a lifestyle brand taken to a ridiculous extreme. It meant that even if a thief was out of prison, he had to live like a pariah to prove he was more outlaw than the guy next to him. It was a purity test that served no purpose other than to feed the ego of the bosses. It proved that organized crime isn't always about the money. Sometimes it's just about having a rule so difficult to follow that it makes you feel superior to the working stiffs who actually have a life. Number 9. The birth canal conflict. The boss over blood rule. One of the most chilling and logically flawed rules of the Cosa Nostra was the total availability clause. A made man was required to be available to the organization 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The specific example given in the 10 Commandments of the mob was that even if your wife was in labor, if the boss called, you had to leave. The mafia spent decades and millions on movies trying to convince the world that they were all about family. They used the language of blood, tradition, and sacred bonds. But this rule exposed the reality. The work family was the only thing that mattered. Your actual blood family, your wife and your newborn child, were just scheduling inconveniences that got in the way of the boss's demands. There is something almost pathetically desperate about this rule. It suggests that the mafia bosses were so insecure about their power that they needed to compete with the birth of a child just to prove they were still the dominant alpha in the room. It wasn't just cruel, it was absurdly revealing. A system that preaches manhood expected its men to fail at the most basic duty of a man, supporting his family during a crisis, just so he could go stand in a parking lot or wait for a phone call that might never come. Nothing says man of honor quite like missing the birth of your son to go watch a warehouse for a guy who doesn't even know your last name. Number 10. The incense threshold. The ritual trap. The triads of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia are famous for their 36 oaths, a series of solemn vows taken during an initiation ceremony that can last for hours. These ceremonies involve incense, altars, blood wine, and symbolic gates. However, tucked away in this mystical theater are rules that feel like they belong in a very paranoid boarding school.
One of the most famous and petty rules involved the incense burner. During the ritual, the initiate has to move through the ritual space in a very specific way. Stepping over an incense burner or accidentally knocking it over wasn't just a clumsy mistake, it was treated as a grave spiritual offense that could result in severe punishment or even the rejection of the candidate. To an outsider, it sounds like a bad joke. You've proven you can handle yourself in a fight, you've proven you can keep your mouth shut, and you've brought in a ton of money, but your career in the underworld is currently on thin ice because you didn't watch your step near a smoking pot of sandalwood. It is a perfect organized crime contradiction. They create this massive cosmic theater to make themselves feel like they are part of a divine hierarchy, but underneath it's just a way to regulate etiquette. It's household management disguised as ancient mysticism. It proves that for all the talk of being raw, street-level powerhouses, these groups are often governed by delicate ritual nerves. One careless step, and suddenly the fearsome gangster is getting a lecture from a temple usher about bodily propriety. The mafia likes to pretend they are the masters of the shadows, but as you can see, they're often just the masters of making things more complicated than they need to be. These rules were meant to build an empire, but they usually just built a lot of awkward stories and embarrassing mistakes. If you thought these rules were dumb, wait till you see the people who actually tried to follow them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.